Welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started now with this panel. The title of the panel is Tapping into Fear, Anger, and Resentment, the Tea Party and the Climate of Threat. I'm going to quickly introduce people so that we don't get late, and I will skip all commentary so that the audience will have more time to have questions and answers. So our first speaker is Charles Postel, who's an associate professor of history at San Francisco State University. He's a product of right here of UC Berkeley, where he earned his bachelor's degree in 1995 and a PhD in history in 2002. His research focuses on late 19th and early 20th century social and political movements, and his book, The Populist Vision, published in 2007 with Oxford, is a history of the original populists of the 1890s, and it won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians, as well as the Bancroft Prize. Our second speaker is Lisa Disch, who is a professor of political science and women's studies at the University of Michigan, where she teaches courses in political theory and feminist theory. Her research interests include gender and politics, political ecology, theories of democracy in both the US and France. And among other things, she's the author of The Tyranny of the Two-Party System, published by Columbia in 2002. She's currently at work on a book on political representation. Our third speaker is Chip Berlet. He's a senior analyst at Political Research Associates, based near Boston. He's a veteran freelance writer and photographer who specializes in investigating right-wing social movements. A Political Research Associate staffer since 1982, he has written, edited, and co-authored numerous articles on right-wing activity and government repression for publications as varied as the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Progressive, the Nation, the Humanist, and the St. Louis Journalism Review. He edited Eyes Right, Challenging the Right-Wing Backlash, which was co-published by the Political Research Associates and South End Press in 1995, and it's a popular primer on the right. He's also co-author with Matthew N. Lyons of Right-Wing Populism in America, Too Close for Comfort, published by Guilford Press in 2000. Our fourth speaker is Devin Burkhardt, and he's vice president of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. He's an internationally recognized expert on right-wing political and social movements, and he's been researching and writing about the right wing since 1992, including groundbreaking investigative work on the militia movement, on white nationalism, the new nativism, and the Tea Party movement. His latest publication is Tea Party Nationalism, a critical examination of the Tea Party movement and the size, strength, and focus of its national factions. In 2007, he was awarded a Petra Foundation Fellowship, and he lives in Seattle. Please join me in welcoming all of them.
The Tea Parties do what they can to look like a movement without leaders or history, and much of the media has gone along. They've treated the Tea Parties as an enigma best explained by the term populism. Newsweek, under the title The Thinking Man's Guide to Populist Rage, ran a cover photo of an angry mob brandishing torches. The photo, of course, comes from the movie Frankenstein, the 1931 version. Populism in media and memory is indeed something of a mad Frankenstein. 55 years ago, Richard Hofstadter suggested that the followers of Joseph McCarthy descended from the populists of the 1890s. Populism, he argued, represented an irrational strain in American thought that had gone sour and turned into a paranoid right-wing extremism. The problem in Hofstadter's analysis is that it did not happen. The political scientist Michael Rogan, who was mentioned earlier by our keynote speaker, tested Hofstadter's theory in his 1967 work, McCarthy and the Intellectuals. And what Rogan confirmed was, yes, There were populists in Wisconsin in the 1890s, and yes, there were followers of Joseph McCarthy in Wisconsin in the 1950s, but there's no other viable connection between populism and McCarthyism besides Wisconsin. And other scholars have confirmed this. The keynote speaker wondered what people who study populism think about this, and yes, this is, other scholars have confirmed what Rogan found. Nonetheless, the notion stuck, and Hofstadter's thesis continues to cast a shadow over the national discussion about the Tea Parties and their historical meaning. It may be a losing proposition to protest the indiscriminate use of the word populism, but the present employment of the term obscures more than it clarifies. The populism of the 1890s was a democratic movement for economic social justice, but there are also currents within populism that were authoritarian, exploitative, patriarchal, and white nationalist. Hence, a spectrum of political phenomena has been described as populism. But the Tea Parties test the limits of the usefulness of the term. Where is the populism in a movement that wants to revert to the gold standard, that seeks to repeal the progressive income tax, that seeks to lift regulations on bankers and oil corporations? In short, where's the populism in a movement that seeks to repeal everything that the original populists stood for? The populism of the 1890s tilled the soil of rural socialism in Kansas and Oklahoma, and it provided the impetus for the reforms of the progressive era, what Glenn Beck describes as the cancer destroying America. Lyndon Baines Johnson inherited his vision of the Great Society from his grandfather, Sam Johnson, a bona fide Texas populist. It might be argued that the racist demagogue George Wallace also accepted elements of redistributive social justice that the populists had introduced into Alabama politics back in the 1890s. But it's hard to detect populist ancestry in the Tea Parties. Tea Parties call themselves conservatives, and to find their historical roots, that is where to look. In the 1930s, a section of business leaders viewed the New Deal as a grave threat. They called Roosevelt a socialist and a tyrant. And led by the DuPont brothers in 1934, they organized the American Liberty League, which declared itself a bipartisan movement of citizens concerned about constitutional principles. Roosevelt, nonetheless, successfully attacked the League as economic royalists. In the 1940s and 50s, the right wing of the Republican Party took up where the Liberty League had left off. But it was Robert Welsh and his business associates in the National Association of Manufacturers who succeeded in turning far-right politics into a grassroots movement. In 1958, they formed the John Birch Society, dedicated to liberating America from the slavery of trade unions, the Social Security Act, and other instruments of collectivism, socialist tyranny, and one world government. However weird their claims, it would be a mistake to underestimate the historical role of the John Birch Society as a conservative mass movement. The JBS organized in parent-teacher associations in churches and mobilized housewives in middle-class neighborhoods. At the time, William Buckley Jr., the dean of the conservative movement, viewed Welsh as a liability and demanded his excommunication from the movement, and the JBS faded from public life. But it did not fade. Today, the ties of the JBS to the Tea Parties are out in public for anyone who cares to look. This past September, for example, September 16th, Sharon Angle, the Tea Party Senate candidate in Nevada, addressed a United Freedom rally in Salt Lake City, sponsored by the National John Birch Society and the Center for Constitutional Studies. The event also had the support of local Birch societies and 912 groups inspired by Glenn Beck. Now, the Center for Constitutional Studies was founded by the late Cleon Skousen, a political ally of Welsh, who was, if anything, yet more paranoid and extreme in his views. Glenn Beck promotes Skousen's books on his television show, and local Tea Parties have made Skousen required reading. calling an elected and moderate president a socialist and a fascist, or equating the estate tax with communism, or constitutional fetishes, or demands to repeal the progressive era, or alarms about one world government. All of these were staples of the far-right politics of the Cold War. And today they are given play by Fox News and appear on Tea Party websites, speeches, and placards. The same demands and rhetoric have also made their way into Republican state platforms from Texas to Maine. Of course, other traditions and influences are at work within the Tea Parties, and we've discussed those today. But the ideological footprints of the Birch-Skousen far right are essential to understanding the Tea Party's historical roots. Just a word about elites. At least since the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800 and the extension of the white male franchise, any political movement seeking power by winning votes has done so in the name of the people, overturning the misrule of whoever is on top. For a time in the 19th century, a successful candidate, no matter how elite, had to claim to be born in a log cabin. With the Tea Parties, you need to know how to dress a moose. The truth is, the Tea Parties resent elites with whom they disagree just as much as they like elites they agree with and who sustain their cause, which makes the category of elite resentment relatively useless. But there's another dimension to the problem of elites. A cornerstone of the Birch Society, of Birch Society education has been to explain that the United States is a republic, not a democracy, where the unfit mob holds sway. And that's the source of the Tea Party demand for the repeal of the 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators. And the resentments and fears of the voting mob are very much alive within the Tea Parties. The Tea Party slogan, "Take Back Our Country," reflects the reality that many within the movement view the election of 2008 as illegitimate, stolen by ignorant and/or illegal black or / illegal voters, illegal immigrant voters, and by voter intimidation by black racialists. And one of the most significant practical results of the rise of the Tea Parties in local politics has been a flurry of legislation across the South, in Texas and elsewhere, to rescind motor voter laws, expand felony disqualifications, add new residency and identification requirements, and to otherwise disfranchise potential voters among national minorities and the poor. Finally, a word about government. The Tea Parties protest federal power trampling on states' rights. And here historical lessons can be drawn from the Sagebrush Rebellion that fueled the anti-government fires during the Reagan years. Ranchers, loggers, miners, and oil drillers protested against the BLM, the EPA, and other federal agencies. Sagebrush rebels challenged federal authority and even threatened secession. Think Todd Palin and the Alaskan Independence Party. But the underlying logic of the rebellion was driven by the dependency of ranchers, loggers, miners, and oil drillers on the federal government. Their most vital interests lay with federal subsidies and services. What aroused the wrath of the rebels was that new stakeholders, environmentalists and tourist recreation industries, were also shaping federal policy. In other words, this was about winners and losers in the high-stake politics of federal largesse. Historically, rage about federal infringements on states' rights has burned hottest when fueled by racial fear and resentment. This was surely the case in the 1950s and 60s when conservatives from Goldwater to Welsh made a pact of alliance with Southern segregationists. And this was surely the case 100 years before that, at the conclusion of the Civil War, when the Federal Freedmen's Bureau provided blankets and food to protect the former slaves from a catastrophe of hunger and exposure. This provoked a backlash of right rage, not only in the former Confederacy, but also in the North. Northern Democrats tapped into the resentments of the white taxpayer, denouncing the Freedmen's Bureau as an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Today, the financial and economic crisis has opened deep wounds. The crisis has hit African American and Latino communities and the urban poor especially hard. Yet efforts to address these wounds are overwhelmed by the rage on the radical right. Rick Santelli's now famous scream that the government might aid the losers in the mortgage crisis has set the terms of the debate about the winners and losers, who the winners and losers will be in the shifting sands of the 21st century political economy. Thank you.
There is no question that fear, anger, and resentment play a role in the Tea Party, or in Tea Party mobilization. Now, the question is what laid the groundwork for that anger and resentment? And we've had a couple times the suggestion that we should see it as a backlash to the 1960s. I want to go back further to the New Deal, and I want to propose that, in fact, the Tea Party is not a backlash against, but an inheritance of the New Deal. I propose an analogy in my paper between the Tea Party and the European social democratic movement that goes under the name of the precariat. And I ask whether we can think of the Tea Party movement as the American precariat. As you can hear, the term precariat is a play on the word proletariat, and it has emerged in Europe to solicit a coalitional, cross-national movement in protest to rollbacks against European-style social democracies. So, the riots that are going on in France this week against raising the retirement age to 62, I know that sounds ridiculous, but frankly, nonetheless, is an example of precariat mobilization. And what the idea behind the precariat is to interpret precariousness as a political condition. And broadly understood, precariousness or precarité as a political condition affects immigrants, both legal and illegal, affects the unemployed, and affects the increasing number of workers employed in temporary positions or doing wage work without benefit of a permanent contract or retirement benefits. So the term precariat is an invitation. It is used by activists in Europe to spark protests against the neoliberalization of social welfare policy that we in the US typically take for granted as imposed upon us by the necessities of the market. So how can the Tea Party be the American precariat? Tea Partiers certainly do not identify as social democrats, nor am I suggesting that they might be made to do so. I make the analogy to the precariat to advance a counterintuitive argument. Tea Party movement, I believe, is sparked in part by the threat that members believe to their share in what is technically a social democratic inheritance. The rhetoric, principles, and voting records of the Tea Party supporters is undeniably conservative. My counterintuitive proposition, however, is that their material commitments place them in a liberal genealogy. They are mobilizing in defense of property interests that are a direct inheritance of New Deal public policy. Insofar as social welfare programs in the US are, and always have been, racialized, including the New Deal, this inheritance is one in which they have a stake as white people. My thesis, then, is that Tea Party mobilization is collective political action in defense of property interests in whiteness that are a New Deal legacy. I do not think they are mobilizing on social grounds as an alternative to their economic interests. I think they are mobilizing to defend economic interests that have been fused with whiteness. Tea Party mobilization is defending its share in what George Lipsitz has called racialized social democracy. Lipsitz characterizes the whole Social Security package that Roosevelt introduced at the New Deal in these terms, because from its inception, Social Security has been both materially and symbolically raced as white. Materially, Social Security did not apply to farm workers and domestics. That provision effectively excluded black workers, in fact, if not in name. Symbolically, Social Security has been aligned with independence and work, characteristics that are, as Christopher Parker showed us, stereotypically attached to white racial identity and juxtaposed against the characteristics of dependency, wastefulness, and laziness that are stereotyped as black. Tea Partiers speak from this material legacy, and you can read it in the signs they carry. You can see it in Kelly Carender's gesture when she waved her $20 bill, as Clarence Lowe was telling us about. She was saying, we whites are tired of being the forgotten man who foots the bill that the elites write for us to pay for the poor. This is a long-standing political trope. It was introduced in the 1890s by William Graham Sumner, but it was not racialized at the start. It was not a black-white antithesis then. It was a poor, it was a working-class elite. It became racialized in the wake of the New Deal and also as a consequence of the systematic campaign to cast poverty as a black problem and welfare as a black pathology. And that campaign, as Marty Gillen's very ably documents, occurs mid to late 50s through today. So the problem with liberal social democratic reform in the US is that it has worked within the forgotten man scenario rather than against it. It has emphasized the virtue of work and the vices of dependency almost as vehemently as conservatives do. So I propose this counterintuitive understanding of the Tea Party, and it might also be a counterintuitive understanding of the New Deal, but it is the truth about the New Deal. I propose this to counter what I perceive as a tendency among some on the left to other Tea Party mobilization as something that is antithetical to liberal America. This othering is most obvious when analysts and opponents paint Tea Party movement in black and white, reducing its motivations to simple racism, which I do not think we've been doing here. I contend that the problem is not simple racism. The problem is a policy legacy in the United States that granted Social Security as property in whiteness, thereby creating material and discursive conditions for precisely the kind of mobilization we are seeing today. In short, I regard the Tea Party mobilization as belonging to liberal America, even as Tea Party rhetoric denounces liberalism and liberals denounce Tea Partiers. I do not make this argument because I think Tea Partiers can be brought into the liberal fold. It is rather that I object to the Democratic strategy of making the Tea Party the instrument of a negative campaign against the Republicans. Tea Party movement calls for a positive counterforce, one that would put forward a language of social citizenship to counter the historic distinction between social insurance and social welfare, and one that would displace the glorification of markets for an ethic of mutual responsibility. This is not unlike what Rick Perlstein argued this morning. Do I think it likely that this Democratic administration or any other would make such a move? No, I do not. But I do believe that something like this is what a counter-hegemonic strategy would entail. So I use the precariat analogy to hold liberals accountable to account for the Tea Party. I also use it because I think it helps us explain one of the biggest contradictions in Tea Party politics, and that is that while overwhelmingly favoring smaller government, and while saying 87% of them, according to the poll that I forgot your first name, Professor Abramowitz gave us, 87% of them think that government is doing too much. But when you ask them if they think Social Security is worth taxpayers' money, Social Security and Medicare, 62% of the Tea Party supporters rate Medicare and Social Security as worth taxpayers' money. Only 50% of them want to phase it out, again, according to that Wall Street Journal poll. Now, the percentage of Tea Party support for Social Security is markedly under the 76% of support in the public generally. However, that 50% of them do not think we should phase out Social Security is striking because it deviates from a typical pattern that you find in survey research. Typically, you will find a strong association between opposition to government and opposition to Social Security, but that is not what we find in the Tea Party. Moreover, enthusiasm for Social Security correlates negatively with education. That is to say, the less educated you are, the more likely you are to appreciate Social Security. That is also not the case in the instance of the Tea Party. They're well-educated, anti-government advocates who favor this particular piece of social democratic legislation, Social Security and Medicare. This position makes sense if we turn back to whiteness. Earlier today, Christopher Parker took us through the battery of questions that survey researchers use to measure what they term racial resentment. Racial resentment could also be thought of as identification with whiteness by means of the forgotten man scenario. People who respond strongly to the questions that Christopher Parker shows us are saying, I'm the forgotten man. I'm paying the bill for people who are lazy and haven't worked as hard as I have. Not surprisingly, people who have high levels of racial resentment oppose government spending on food stamps and other aspects of the welfare program that go to people who are seen as out of work. However, when it comes to government spending on Social Security, high scores on racial resentment correlate directly with support for spending on Social Security. This makes sense if we think about whiteness, because for these responders, their opposition to spending on welfare is not motivated exclusively by free market principles, but rather by their sense of injury that they, hardworking whites, are made to finance compensatory programs for underachieving blacks and other minorities. So, as Christopher Parker showed us, Tea Party true believers make precisely the identification between whiteness and work that correlates with support for Social Security spending. Now, Tea Partiers can defend Medicare and Social Security even as they object to big government because they regard these as rights they have earned. This, too, is a New Deal legacy. At its inception, Roosevelt presented Social Security as old age insurance. This was a rhetorical framing that implied a return for work and investment and differentiated the Social Security part of the package from those parts that provided aid to the poor. And in addition, as I've noted, what counted for work for the purposes of Social Security was performed by whites. So, simply put, whiteness is, as Cheryl Harris argued, political property in the United States. This was most palpably true during the slaveholding years when being white meant that you were presumed not to be a slave. This was also palpably true during the segregation years when passing for white meant access to jobs that no visibly black-skinned person could hold. Now, certainly, white identity is no longer a legal prerequisite for entry into social, economic, and political power. However, this only makes it more difficult to recognize the continued property interests that whites have, and I include myself in this, by being white. It does not mean that those interests have disappeared. They most certainly exist in the forms of expectations about job security, workers' rights, health insurance, and retirement security that are guaranteed by New Deal public policies that distributed these forms of security not as rights of citizenship, but as race-based privileges. Now, that social benefits in the United States have never been universal is one strong reason why one would argue there cannot be an American precariat. My point, again, is not that we have here a social democratic movement like the one in Europe, but rather that we have here a group that feels its own status to be threatened and objects to what they perceive as new government programs extending middle-class status to undeserving people by means of new social benefits that they will have to pay for. What makes the Tea Party unlike the European precariat is that they do not recognize that they did not earn their own middle-class status. It is dependent on the government-sponsored programs of the New Deal, programs that set the terms on which whites would be perceived as responsible self-serving agents and blacks addicted to aid, programs that lifted many working-class families, including my own, into the middle class. To conclude, my point is that Tea Partiers are defending material interests that are properly theirs by the social democratic programs of the New Deal, and they're doing so in the language that is available to them. If that language is not one that recognizes government responsibility for vulnerability, that's because even social democratic public policy in the US has never been couched in these terms of social citizenship. I propose this somewhat contentious angle on the Tea Party because I think that politically it is more fruitful to recognize their fear and anger as a creation of liberalism than as something antithetical to it. Because as liberals, we can't do much to correct the mindset of our fellow citizens. We can, however, demand a stronger and more social democratic liberalism.
So I've been madly adding and throwing out cards based on the first two presentations. So this is fabulous. I'm also going to be a curmudgeon and counterintuitive. I want to dedicate this to Sarah Diamond, who was a student of Rogan, and Sarah Diamond was my mentor in studying the Christian right, and her papers are also here at UC Berkeley. And I'm going to be using a model developed by Margaret Canavan in her book on populism, which argues there are many different kinds of populism. And I'm going to say the very counterintuitive thing is that before the People's Party and the agrarian prairie populists, there were other forms of populism in America, if you look back using the model presented by Canavan and Kazin. And I would say that if you want to look back far enough, you can find populist rhetoric and a style of organizing in Bacon's Rebellion and in the Ku Klux Klan. I know that's a controversial statement. How do you organize a movement in defense of white privilege in 2010 when Glenn Beck claims he's Martin Luther King? It's a problem. One of the ways you do this is to rely on the trope of subversion and betrayal, which is as old as the Calvinist colonists who helped engage in putting large stones on witches, which is the idea that if you define the idealized community as under attack and that only aggressive apocalyptic action can save it from betrayal and subversion, you can mobilize people to do just about anything. And so this has happened in America with the Freemasons, who were taking over America in the early 1800s, then the Catholics. The Palmer raids were aimed at Italian anarchists and Russian Bolsheviks, and thousands of people were deported with no evidence whatsoever. Then we had the Red Scare, and who can forget Martin Luther King? Here's a picture of him at the Highlander Center with a big arrow, and it's Martin Luther King at Communist Training School. We forget that one of the main aspects of the anti-civil rights organizing was that it was essentially these otherwise happy black people were being mobilized by communists, and depending on what newspaper you read at the time, it was communists and Jews. The political struggle that's going on now does date back to Roosevelt, and it is very complicated, and a lot of white privilege is implicated in this. If you go back, and I urge you to look at the Roosevelt v. Hoover campaign speeches, Hoover comes right out and says that if we abandon rugged individualism and abide by collectivism, we're going to be no better than those Europeans. And Roosevelt is talking about, feeding people. So, the more things change. So social movements pull political parties in their direction, not the other way around, something the Democrats have forgotten and the Republicans learned from the labor and civil rights and women's movement. I don't know why the Democrats haven't picked up on it. I suspect that most of the people in the Democratic Leadership Council don't want a mass movement because they're very happy being ruling elites without bothering with democracy whatsoever, thus giving lie to the very name of their political party. Now, people who join right-wing social movements are not ignorant, stupid, or crazy, and social science shows this. The populist agrarian People's Party movement of the 1800s was not an irrational outburst whatsoever. Hofstadter, Lipset, Bell are all wrong. But they're right about some of the facts involved, and so we can't dismiss their research. We can say that their conclusions are wrong, and what comes out of that then is a whole set of theories about how people are mobilized. And Tilley, who's a sociologist. And by the way, when the Democrats and liberals claim, and I know we all love Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann, but when they claim that this is a movement of stupid, ignorant, and crazy people, they are either ignorant or liars. And I just want to make that clear, because they're manipulating you against the Tea Party movement, some of whose grievances are actually quite legitimate, and many of which are not, and it's separating them that's really critical. Tilley says in terms of social movement theory that movements are either organized around opportunities or threat or fear. And basically, I'm going to argue that the Tea Party movement has been mobilized using John Birch Society theories built around conspiracies of liberal betrayal. And in this sense, these conspiracy theories are a narrative form of scapegoating used to mobilize people around mythical enemies, which displace anger, not just about the economy towards the wrong target, but also displace rejected and sublimated anger around race and gender. Because how do you organize a movement in defense of white privilege and male privilege and heterosexual privilege in 2010? You displace it onto a mythical chimera, an enemy, a mythical other that threatens the community and which demands an apocalyptic response before it is too late. It also justifies you using aggression against the enemy because better you get them before they get you. And this apocalyptic narrative is as old as written history. The elements of right-wing populism that Matt Lyons and I write about in our book, Right-Wing Populism in America, that we list are dualism, demonization, scapegoating, conspiracism, and apocalyptic aggression. And I think we can see this in the Tea Party movement, but also many movements all the way back to the colonial period in various forms. One of the ways that this is developed is a storyline called producerism, which political scientists and historians write about. And that's the idea that there's a noble, hardworking, productive middle class being betrayed by above and below them. And so the secret elites up above are parasitic, evil people. And they are picking the pocket of the heroic middle class and taking that tax money and paying for lazy, sinful, and subversive parasites below on the political system. And this is called producerism. It has a name. They don't call themselves producerists, except occasionally they do, like William Rusher talks about the productive people. And so they actually, in one of the conspiracy books sent out by the John Birch Society, on one page is a huge vice with, like, you know, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers up on top and the Yippies and the, you know, common cause down below. And it's Glenn Beck. It's the Glenn Beck chalk talk, except Glenn Beck is channeling, or some would say plagiarizing, the John Birch Society narrative. Anyway, so if you look at this then as through a race, class, gender analysis, there are all sorts of power struggles at play. And it is very easy to hide the racist and gender-related defense of unfair power and privilege by writing these stories about apocalyptic outcomes if Obama is allowed to continue in office, unless we stop him now. Now, you can look at this in terms of other categories, especially around gender. If you look at the anti-Roosevelt coalition, it was a coalition between corporate, very large corporate interests, economic free market people and some libertarians, and the Christian right, which existed in the 1930s. There's a great book called The Old Christian Right about it. And this was a coalition that was mostly focused on economics and the idea of rugged individualism as not just being an important political point of view, but it puts you right with God in a hierarchical relationship, and the idea that we heard before that too much government means less God. And so this was a very deeply rooted coalition. After the World War II, Buckley reestablished this coalition, leaving out two very important elements which were necessary. He did not allow overt anti-Semitism into the coalition. And he began to work with people around the issue of race. Not in a great way, but at least he could see this was going to be coming. So fusionism after World War II, a la Buckley, were the moral traditionalists, the anti-communists, the sort of the militarists, and the economic libertarians. And we go towards then the Goldwater campaign, where the first attempt to take over the Republican Party succeeds on the political level, but they forget to build a mass base. Didn't work. Goldwater gets smushed. So the people who built the Goldwater campaign go back to the drawing board and decide they're going to form an alliance with these televangelists. Now, what's really crucial here is that at this moment, right around 1977 to 79, you have Anita Bryant in 77 in Dade County building an anti-gay campaign. You have Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop putting out a series of books and films about abortion and why Protestants need to become involved in the anti-abortion movement. You have all kinds of Supreme Court decisions that have been sort of backing up on pornography and obscenity. And so you have the 1979 creation of the moral majority. Jerry Falwell leads it, but it's a construction of this coalition. But what Randall Balmer discovers is that while abortion becomes the key issue for the new Christian right in 1979, what got the mass base involved and working on both the state level and on the federal level was Jimmy Carter's decision to threaten to revoke the tax status of segregated white Christian academies. And so you have already in 1979 abortion, a gender issue, as a stand-in also for racial anxiety. And so we have to be clear that this is something that's been going on for a very long time. I'm not saying their opposition to abortion and gay rights wasn't real. I'm saying that it was part of a package of race, class, gender hierarchies that you cannot take apart. We know these folks live in information silos. I think it's important to understand that apocalyptic belief in America is not unusual. People who scoff at the idea that 14% of Republicans in New Jersey think Obama is the Antichrist and 15% think it's possible, should remember pamphlets like this: Will the Antichrist come out of Russia? A huge percentage of the American population that is in Christianity outside of mainstream religious denominations think that the end times and the struggle against Satan is absolutely real. And don't forget that the culture war involved all sorts of issues that were racialized as well. Communism, hypnotism, and the Beatles. Right, in which the communist menace is woven into the idea of brainwashing and the 4/4 time of rock music. You get the picture. And that whole idea of sexualized rock music is racialized because these are jungle rhythms, primitive jungle rhythms, and there's overtly racist kind of construction of this whole kind of thing. You can have this rhetoric. Is Obama Hitler and Stalin? Yeah, we laugh at it, but that was in fact the theory of Friedrich von Hayek, a Nobel Prize-winning economist and a conservative icon. Are we going to unplug grandma? We laugh at it. That was the theory of Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop, who wrote this book, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and made the films, which Reagan endorsed. And so on these bookshelves and these Tea Party people are all of these ideas, and they may get them garbled, but they're deeply rooted in this right-wing populist tradition of producerism, which is very much woven into the American body politic. I know a lot of people don't think the term populism should be used in this way, but there's a whole group of social scientists who use the term populism to describe a way of organizing a style. And they write about it in Europe, they write about it in the US, and they write about it in India with groups like the RSS and their attempt to build a racial nationalist movement around these themes of betrayal and threat. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Come on, you all can do better now. I know it's the last presentation. That's much, much better. Thank you. My name is Devin Burkhardt, and I am not a witch. Despite what Glenn Beck said on his television program last night, I am in fact not. I am, however, the Institute for Research and Education's on Human Rights is resident data geek, and what I want to talk about with you today is some of the findings of a recent report we released with the NAACP called Tea Party Nationalism, a critical examination of the size, scope, and focus of the Tea Party movement and its national factions. As many of you probably heard this last week, we released this report with the NAACP. My paper today explores some of the important aspects of the findings of this 94-page report, pictured there, and which you all can download freely at teapartynationalism.com. Particularly, we're going to focus today on the aspects of the findings in regards to the questions around race and nationalism. The study, in fact, is a snapshot in time. As Heraclitus once says, you can't step twice into the same stream. If we were to write this report a year from now, it would look differently than it would if we wrote it last year than doing it today. But it provides us at least an indicator of where we're at in terms of the Tea Party, in terms of their size, scope, and their origins. This exhaustive, data-driven study contravenes many of the Tea Party's self-invented myths, particularly the supposed sole concentration on budget deficits, taxes, and the power of the federal government. Instead, Tea Party ranks are increasingly permeated with concerns about race and national identity and other so-called culture war issues. In these ranks, the abiding obsession with Barack Obama's birth certificate is often a stand-in for the belief that the first black president of the United States is not a quote-unquote real American. Rather than strict adherence to the Constitution, many Tea Partiers are now challenging the provision for birthright citizenship found in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Tea Partiers have, in fact, torn down many of the walls of the issue silos that have separated the conservative movement for many decades. If you look at the driving policy issues for the majority of the Tea Party factions we cite in this report, after the failure to stop healthcare reform, you'll see an undeniable turn in the direction towards issues around race and national identity. Support for Arizona's controversial SB 1070, the so-called Papers, Please bill. opposition to the Park 51 Islamic Center in Manhattan, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, opposition to the DREAM Act, and many others, all of which fall well outside the parameters of the popularly constructed Tea Party mission statement. Moreover, the relationship between hardcore white nationalists and the Tea Party movement has become a two-way street. National Tea Party organizations have given platforms to anti-Semites and racists, and hardcore white nationalists have been attracted to these protests, looking for potential recruits and hoping to push these white protesters, these overwhelmingly white protesters, as many of the folks before me today have indicated, towards a more self-conscious and ideological white supremacy. Interestingly, when we started looking at the data, one thing we found particularly interesting. We found that while Tea Partiers and their supporters are concerned about the economic recession that we're currently in, the data tells us that there is in fact no observable statistical link between Tea Party membership and unemployment levels. You'll note in the report a regression analysis to this question that examines these very same issues. And their storied opposition to political and social elites turns out to be predicated on an antagonism to federal assistance to those deemed the undeserving poor. The Tea Party movement has unleashed a still inchoate political movement by angry middle class and overwhelmingly white people who believe that this country, their nation, has been taken from them and they want it back. The Tea Party movement has used the oft-repeated phrase, take it back, take your country back. Now this in and of itself is an explicitly nationalist refrain. It's sometimes coupled with the assertion that there are quote-unquote real Americans, as opposed to others they believe are driving this country into some sort of socialist ditch. The data indicates that there is less populism here and more of a mixture of ultranationalism and or super-patriotism. The Tea Party movement as a whole is a multi-million-dollar-a-year complex that includes for-profit corporations, non-profit, non-party organizations, and political action committees. The Tea Party phenomenon exists at about 3 different levels of agreement and commitment. As we've already heard today, several national opinion polls point to support for the Tea Parties running at approximately anywhere between 16 and 27% of the adult population, which would put the number of Tea Party sympathizers in the millions. That would be the outermost ring of support. At the next level is a large, less defined group of a couple million activists who go to meetings, buy the literature, listen to Glenn Beck, and attend the protests. At the core, we found, are more than 280,000 members in all 50 states who have signed up to the websites of the 6 different organizational networks that form the core of this movement. Our work focuses on that core. We map the location of the memberships of these factions, we look at the gender breakdown of these factions, and we explore the relationship between these different various factions. There are the 6 different national factions listed there. The 1776 Tea Party, also known as teaparty.org, Tea Party Nation, Freedom Works, the Tea Party Patriots, ResistNet, and the Tea Party Express. We've identified these 6 core national organizational networks or factions. The leading figures in one national faction, the 1776 Tea Party, were imported directly from the anti-immigrant vigilante group known as the Minuteman Project. The Tea Party Nation has provided a gathering place for so-called birthers and has attracted Christian nationalists and nativists. The Tea Party Express so outraged the public with its racist pronouncements of its leader, Mark Williams, that other national factions have recently eschewed any ties to it. Both ResistNet and Tea Party Patriots, the 2 largest of these networks, in fact, harbor long-time anti-immigrant nativists and racists. And Tea Party Patriots has opened the door to those aiming to repeal the 17th Amendment and direct election of the United States senators. These 6 national factions have membership that looks something like this in aggregate. And you'll find all this data available to anyone on teapartynationalism.com. And we have more detailed data for anyone who's interested. It shows you kind of a disbursement of the pattern around the country. These 6 national factions and their members have roughly 3,000 affiliated local chapters. You can see their locations here. Again, this is something better to look at the website because you can drill in and see exactly what's going on in your state or in your local community. Now, look at a look at the graph counting Tea Party numbers over time shows that the organizations are continuing to grow. The different national factions are all not growing at the same rate, however. The Tea Party Patriots and Resistant Net, the two largest lines there, are the two factions with the most diffuse, locally based organizational structures, and they're experiencing the fastest rates of growth. This would tend to indicate that a larger movement is less susceptible to central control and more likely to attract racist and nativist elements at the local level. Simply put, as the data shows us, the Tea Parties are not going away after the midterm elections, and they cannot expect it, and we can expect, however, to have a continuing impact on the public policy debate into the future. It should not be expected, however, that the Tea Party movement will have the same organizational configurations for the indefinite future. At a minimum, some sorting out process is likely to occur, particularly after these midterm elections. Now, it would be a mistake of the highest order to claim that all Tea Partiers are nativist vigilantes or racists of one stripe or another, and this paper manifestly does not make that claim. Nevertheless, the impact of President Barack Obama's election and the fact that the first family of the United States have ancestors who were once directly property of white people has, in fact, had an effect. It is not a direct and mechanical effect, like hitting a cue ball to a 9-ball into the corner pocket, but it is identifiable nonetheless. Consider, for example, the incessant depiction of Barack Obama as a non-American. This theme began among those who regard him as a non-native born American who should not rightly, or constitutionally they argue, hold the presidency. The permutations go on from there. Islamic terrorist, socialist, African witch doctor, lying African, etc. If he were not properly American, then he becomes the other. That is not us. In fact, 5 of the 6 of the national factions we're talking about here today have these so-called birthers in their leadership, the one exception being FreedomWorks. As already discussed today, both polling data and observable evidence point to the fact that the Tea Party attendees and their supporters are overwhelmingly white. Significantly, these white Tea Partiers show noticeably different attitudes than those of white people generally, particularly in regards to racially charged issues. These numbers indicate racially and cultural differences that morph directly into opposing beliefs about immigration, national identity, and the question that haunts this Tea Party movement: who is an American? The Revolutionary War era costumes, the yellow "Don't Tread on Me" Gadsden flags from the same era, the overstated veneration of the Constitution, and the defense of American exceptionalism in a world that has turned to transnational economies and global institutions are all signs of an overarching nationalism that helps define the Tea Party movement. It is a form of American nationalism, however, that does not include all Americans, and it separates itself from those it regards as insufficiently, quote-unquote, real Americans. Consider in this regard a recent Tea Party Nation newsletter article entitled "Real Americans Did Not Sue Arizona," or the handwritten sign from a Tea Party rally, obviously written in earnest, that says, "I am an arrogant American. Unlike our president, I am proud of my country, our freedom, our generosity. No apology from me." It is a notion that President Barack Obama is not a real natural-born American, that he is some other kind of person that abounds in Tea Party ranks and draws the movement into this pit of no return. Indeed, these claims have become so widespread that they have corresponded to an uptick in the number of Americans who believe that President Obama is not a Christian, as he professes, but in fact a Muslim. Shortly before he took office in March 2009, 11% of Americans believed he was Muslim. In August of 2010, the Pew Research Center measured that number at 18%. While social scientists have not yet to pinpoint this jump in numbers as caused by the Tea Partiers' propaganda, it was during this period of intense Tea Party opposition to Obama and his supposedly Muslim roots. Which brings us to the issue of Islamophobia in the Tea Parties. Alongside racism, anti-Semitism, the elements of Islamophobia have found their way into the Tea Party movement. Tea Party leaders and members have employed anti-Muslim language, and they continue to push Islamophobia as a new cutting-edge wedge issue. It is not my contention that all Tea Partiers are consciously racist. The evidence speaks for itself. In the report, you'll find a plethora of examples of racist vitriol on the part of Tea Party leaders, incidents where well-known anti-Semites and white supremacists have been given platforms by national Tea Party groups, and an analysis of the attempts by white nationalist organizations to find new recruits in Tea Party ranks. I won't spare you all the details, but I'll give you just a few examples. One of those is a gentleman by the name of Rowan Garcia Quintana. He's a South Carolina GOP operative who's been actively involved in Tea Party activities throughout South Carolina. What he doesn't disclose on his bio is he's also a national board member of the Council of Conservative Citizens, the literal reincarnation of the old white citizens councils, the group that Thurgood Marshall used to refer to as the Uptown Klan. And in fact, Council of Conservative Citizens activists now are active in the states of Florida, South Carolina, and Mississippi, running Tea Parties and participating in local Tea Party events. There are many of these examples which we could go through, but I encourage you to read the report to take a look at them. Now, these doubts and denials about President Obama's Americanness have been coupled with an often growing level of nativist activity and sentiment from both the grassroots and leadership of Tea Party factions. In 2007, at the height of anti-immigrant organizing, there was a 600% increase in anti-immigrant activity, growing from 135 different local and state level anti-immigrant organizations to more than 400. By 2010, many of those organizations had virtually disappeared, and we asked ourselves, where had they gone? The answer we found out is they moved themselves right into the Tea Parties, changed their names, but became quite active inside the Tea Parties. At a policy level, they've worked not only to impede progress on comprehensive immigration reform and breathe new life into H.R. 1868, the so-called Birthright Citizenship Act of 2009. This bill would end birthright citizenship in the United States for American-born children of parents without papers. It would present a direct constitutional challenge to the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War to guarantee the rights of newly freed slaves and their children. It is here, at the conjunction of nativism, opposition to birthright citizenship, and the denigration of President Obama, and the fear of a new majority in American life, that the unstated racism embedded within the Tea Party becomes vocal and unmistakable. Now, the data we present here in Tea Party nationalism is just the beginning. To advance the understanding of the Tea Parties, that data we've collected about the Tea Parties, we're more than willing to share with scholars and journalists and others who have questions about the Tea Party and the trajectory which they're taking. Thank you very much.
Questions? Some people who haven't.
Chip, one of the first people I saw this morning was Chip, and he advised me not to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I think it was about a month ago there was a situation where someone from LA was caught drink driving on the way up to San Francisco to basically shoot up some people from the Tides Foundation and other places like that. And there have been some connections drawn between the activity of a certain commentator and that person's direct action. And I wonder if we're likely to see a sort of a Timothy McVeigh kind of scenario, and I wonder what the tone of this meeting would have been like if that person hadn't been pulled over by a Californian highwayman, Californian highway policeman. My question is, it seems to me that we're being very polite, and I wonder if there are any legal mechanisms. One that comes to mind is the criminal syndicalism laws that were passed to crush the Wobblies in the Central Valley, but there's certainly provisions there to, and there's a case history. I know it's largely been quashed, but I mean, it certainly might be a symbolic act. You know, that's my question. Are there, you know, legal avenues?
I think it's a dangerous road to go down. I understand that people are scared. I understand there's a potential for violence. Devin and I were part of a movement in the 90s where we had a meeting months before the Oklahoma City bombing warning the federal government that there was a likelihood of violence given the escalation of rhetoric. So I think it's very clear that in social science there is a relationship between scapegoating and demonization and this apocalyptic idea that time is running out. And the first group of people to act on that tend to be mentally unstable. But the second group are people who are ideologues, in which I put Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh was not mentally unstable. He was an ideologue who carried out an act of terrorism as part of a neo-Nazi cell to get the militia movement to move in that direction towards open insurgency. So I have had no problem saying that Bill O'Reilly is not legally culpable but was morally responsible for the assassination of Dr. Tiller. And in a civilized society, he would not be allowed on the air. He would be given a shopping cart and a place to stand to scream on a street corner. And I would say the same thing about Glenn Beck. The First Amendment guarantees his right to be a person who misrepresents history and builds up hate towards scapegoated targets. But we know that his rhetoric about the Tides Foundation was specifically one of the causes of this poor person's attack on the Tides Foundation. So, you know, this is a dynamic that we are in the middle of. I can't predict when violence will occur, but this kind of rhetoric increases the likelihood of violence, moving from the unstable population who are wound up and pointed towards these targets towards a more mass form of resistance. And I think that that's both social science and history.
Yes, I agree with you that it can be somewhat dangerous, but it seems to me that I was just giving a lecture yesterday on the rise of Jim Crow and the black codes. And C. Van Wood, it seems to me, makes a very interesting point. He suggests that the development of this Jim Crow was because of the relaxation of support and the struggle of the opposition to it, to the treatment of black people. Okay? Now, the real question is not that I would agree with you that they should have free speech. But it seems to me we don't see a movement, particularly from the Democratic Party, I'll be very frank, and others who are attempting to address some of these questions that could potentially lead to a serious confrontation. And the final point I would make is, for people who are concerned, who will be the victims of that confrontation, the question is, when do we start getting ready?
I'll start with the last part of the question first, as to when we should start getting ready. I would say a year ago, when the Tea Party started, to be perfectly blunt with you. I do think, however, the tide is beginning to turn, and those of us who are concerned about Tea Party's turn towards issues around race and national identity are finally starting to mobilize an opposition in preparation for these issues coming to a head. So when I was in Washington, D.C. just on Wednesday, we met with folks from the NAACP, the National Council of La Raza, the Asian American Justice Center, and others who are beginning to have discussions about formulating a plan to take on these issues. Do I wish these discussions would have happened last year? I had a full head of hair back then, and I was, trying to get people to pay attention to this stuff. But I think we may have finally turned the corner on these issues. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel. If it's stuff you're concerned about, please go to Tea Party Nationalism, sign up to get alerts and updates, and we'll keep you informed on what's going on and what people can do, to speak out against it.
Okay. First, I have a quick and shameless plug, and then a question, I promise. So I wanted to get back to what Mr. Perlstein was saying at the beginning about how the only thing that will defeat right-wing populism is left-wing populism. And I work with an organization called U.S. for All of Us, which is a national network of anti-racist whites who are stepping up to say no to racism and hate, and trying to put forward politics of liberation to contest these politics of domination, specifically in this moment with the rise of the Tea Party movement. And just to give a sense of our work, recently we mobilized hundreds of activists and ordinary individuals to go to Arizona to fight SB 1070 and the anti-immigrant hysteria there. And we're continuing to work together to defeat the Secure Communities legislation on a federal level. And so we have a sign-up sheet in the front. If you want to go put your name down, we can stay in touch if you want to get involved or find out more. And then about this panel, now that we have sort of elaborated on the climate of threat and the very clear threats that the Tea Party movement poses, I was wondering if we could think about this moment dialectically, especially since the right wing is certainly thinking dialectically with Glenn Beck thinking he is the new Martin Luther King. And I wanted to ask, what sort of opportunities you all think that the rise of the Tea Party movements offers the left and the possibility for liberatory social change in this country.
Well, I mean, I don't know, I must be really depressed, but I think the Tea Party has ruined the Obama presidency, and I don't think that's an opportunity. I think it's a disaster.
I take a slightly different view.
Good.
I think that actually the Tea Party provides us an important teachable moment. What they've done by tearing down the various issue silos inside the conservative ranks is given us a clearly definable opposition in one camp. No longer do we have to worry about one particular wing of the conservatives attacking environmentalists, and another wing attacking civil rights, and another wing attacking gay and lesbian rights, and another wing attacking civil liberties. It's all in one package right now. It's all in one opposition. And it allows those of us who are concerned about these issues to break down our issue silos as well and to begin forming new coalitions for those of us who are concerned about workers' rights and environmental protection and civil and human rights. All of us have an ample opportunity to work together, to stand united as one nation working together and promote an inclusive definition of who and what we are as a nation in the 21st century, as opposed to the exclusive kind of nationalism being promoted by the Tea Party movement. This, I will remind you, is merely the first battle in a long struggle that's going to take place for the next 50 years as we continue to go through these demographic changes that the United States is going on. These are only the opening salvos, and we need to start thinking about it both for the short term and the long term, how we build innovative and creative new alliances and coalitions to confront these new challenges in whatever form they emerge in. Because today it's a Tea Party, next year it'll be something else potentially. We need to, figure out how to deal with those for the long term.
I think, is this on? Is this working? Can you hear me? In the Depression of 1893, there was a very fast response among farmers and laborers to the Great Depression of 1893. They marched on Washington. They demanded a huge stimulus bill in the form of road construction. The Populists put their mark on the agenda, the Populists at that time, which was, the federal government should play an active role in creating a more equitable and just society and getting the economy back working again. Interestingly, that did not happen in the Great Crisis of 1929 at all. It took years and years and years. Yes, Roosevelt is elected in 1932, but even then, the first New Deal is no great shakes. I mean, the first New Deal was basically a means to raise prices for the corporations so they could regain their profitability and throw poor farmers off the land through price support systems. It took years for a movement to get underway. I think the American economy is in very bad shape. I think the Achilles heel of the Tea Parties is they say absolutely nothing to address the real economic insecurities faced by Americans. None of their issues will improve, will help people who are going to lose their homes, or help people get jobs, or help people deal with this crisis. It's all about, we are concerned about inflation someday in the future. We're concerned about these deficits, our grandchildren paying them. Well, what about people keeping in their homes today, or keeping a roof over their head? And so I think it's way too early to tell how this crisis will break out. The disaster hitting our cities, hitting the African American community, hitting much of America, is at depression levels. And already today. And the failure to address that at the level of government, the level of administration, and in terms of what's happening in the streets is striking, but it's not unprecedented. I think you should look at what happened in 1932, 1933. These things work in mysterious ways, and we don't know.
I just have a quick question. Do you think the 16 to 26% of Tea Party sympathizers really understand that racism and white supremacy is inherent to the movement?
Well, I think the polling data shows that overall, and Chris can talk more specifically about this in terms of the data that he's collected, but what it shows in general is that Tea Partiers generally have more negative attitudes towards black people and more racially divisive attitudes towards a number of the other issues we've talked about, like immigration and a variety of others. So do I think that it's that all 16 to 27% are conscious? Do they have a conscious white identity? I don't think so. Not yet. Absolutely. I think that's the concern, right? If they're able to make a transformation from this kind of unconscious racism to a crystallized, self-identified white nationalism, then we've got real trouble on our hands. We haven't seen that yet, but that's something, we're going to keep looking at the data to find out where we're going and, what needs to be done about it.
Right. It's not just about race. I want to make it clear. It's not just about race. It's about the other. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
The other.
It's not simply about race.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
The other just happens to not be white.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of comment and ask Lisa Disch about your presentation, as I really, really enjoyed it. I think that the lens of whiteness and white privilege within sort of the welfare state is really important to understanding this. But I also sort of, at the end, you made this comment about liberals and liberalism as being able to pull us out of this. And I'm just sort of worried because it seems to me that liberalism itself might be the problem because sort of post-civil rights, we've defined the racial struggle as a struggle for like an equality, an individual equality in relationship to state institutions in a way that really decontextualizes the racial struggle. So we can use sort of the language of collectivization and say, sort of collective responsibility, but that still doesn't get us back to historicizing race. And I see that sort of as a failure within liberalism, within its sort of philosophical underpinnings of meritocracy and those kinds of concepts that don't. So I'm just sort of wondering if you see a way out of that box, or yeah, that's all.
Good luck.
That you have a very good analysis of liberalism, and thank you for the question. I don't mean exactly to say that liberalism can be the answer to our problems. I'm just saying that if we are liberals, many of us are. I mean, it depends how you identify. I usually identify as a progressive, but it's, it just shouldn't be the case that we can win an election with a pretty good electoral majority and have the repeated embarrassment of a president who can just barely squeak through watered down policies, and who has no sort of, he seems to feel he has no leg to stand on in terms of a more powerful social agenda. which wouldn't just be about race. It would really be about, I think, I like Rick Perlstein's bringing back the language of social citizenship. We need social citizenship. And we need not to have democratic leaders as sort of kowtowing to a language of the market, although I don't think Obama's kowtowing. I think he believes in it, which is a problem with him. Yeah, but, you know, and the idea that the single payer system is just off. For example, in the example of healthcare, the idea that that's just off the table, we can't even begin to speak there. We can't live with this. And you know, I just feel mad because this is our turn. We won. And he has governed. I mean, George Bush didn't win. Like, someone gave him that election. And he governed as if he had a mandate. What the hell? You know, that's not how party politics is supposed to work. It's our turn. So. I do think they've made it harder for him. I think they've lent the Republican Party the appearance of a grassroots base, which has legitimated their politics of obstructionism, which is completely unacceptable in a democracy. What they are doing is utterly undemocratic. This is not how pluralist democracy works. You're not allowed to just say no to everything the president wants. And the Tea Party movement gives them the illusion that they are speaking for a majority when they aren't.
So my question's for Chip Berlet. One thing I notice that's frustrating to me is that whether we're talking about Democrats or Republicans, there's this consensus about how the economy works and who the producers are, and that the Democrats accept that it's business owners are the motor of the economy. And what's interesting to me in your analysis of producerism is that if we look at the early New Deal or even the Populist Party, that they had a leftist articulation of producerism, meaning they challenged at that time laissez-faire economics, the hegemony then, by saying, no, in fact, the motor of the economy is workers. And with the labor union, with the AFL-CIO, from my reading of it, they were able to redefine who the motor of the economy is. Coming back to your point about forgotten man, Roosevelt used the term, the forgotten man. He said the forgotten man is those at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So why has the left ceded or abandoned this struggle to define who the workers are or who the producers are, who contribute to the economy, and accepted that it's the business owners, basically trickle down? And do you think this is a worthy ideological and political task to take on, or is producerism, it seems from your analysis, inevitably connected to white nationalism?
Well, in the U.S., producerism has been historically connected to white nationalism, because when you shake your fist at those corrupt elites that are a caricature of power relationships in the U.S., you can't reach them, but you can step on Native people, black people, immigrants, and now gay people, Muslims, and feminists and abortion providers. So producerism isn't the solution. Understanding the equitable distribution of wealth in society across a variety of sectors so that there is fairness, that's a demand of progressives and labor unions and all kinds of people on the left, and a lot of church folks too, I might add. You know, I come out of a radical Christian tradition, and that's still my operating philosophy, and I don't see how Glenn Beck gets away with invoking, you know, an idea of religiosity when he's talking about, you know, basically empowering very wealthy people to get wealthier and blaming everything on these scapegoats. It's just wrong. But here's the thing. It's not that producerism is about people who actually work. It's this model of this fantasy of how power really works. That, in fact, the actual populist movement didn't use producerism. It talked about a new way of developing capital social relations that were more equitable. That's right. That's a good way of putting it. It wasn't producerist in this model at the beginning. It deformed into that in some cases at the end. So this is about who has power in this country, who has wealth in this country, and how should power and wealth actually be divided up. And what a shock. Straight white Christian men like me don't want to let go. Why would we? Well, you know, philosophically and religiously, I think I should. But If you, in fact, are scared of letting go of male privilege, of heterosexual privilege, of white privilege, then you come up with all these reasons why you deserve it. And that's what producerism is. It's not this idea of who actually is running the country. It's this caricature of why you are the only people who count, the middle-class white person. But
that's your take on it. I mean, you could say that producerism is about the labor theory of value, which is Marx uses the labor theory of value. Hoover uses the wealth.
As a Marxist, I'm going to say I just don't buy that analysis of what Marx is saying, and there is, in fact, if you want to get into the specifics, Bonapartism. You know, producerism is Bonapartism, whereas actual working class solidarity is something very different.
I hate when people use their time to mic to make a comment instead of a question, but I mean, something keeps coming up that I want to make a comment about, which is that. When we talk about the democratic failures, we can't avoid the fact that the Senate is built now, didn't used to be built this way, but it's built so that nothing can pass. And George Bush's accomplishments, which you mentioned, the biggest accomplishment from policy perspectives were No Child Left Behind, which was not a, we don't like it, but was not a conservative accomplishment. The biggest conservative accomplishment was the tax cuts, which passed with reconciliation. So there really wasn't much with the way that Republicans gamed this by blocking Al Franken and doing a couple other things that Democrats could pass that more. And it's interesting that we're going to see an election where Democrats get disappointed that their party can't do more things and punish it by making a Senate more Republican that will do even less things. So I guess I'm not phrasing, but this is such a banal point, but really there's no other democracy that works like this. The equivalent of everything in Britain being handed the House of Lords, basically. And I don't know if there is a question, whether you think progressives or anyone else needs to confront this, because the Tea Party, I can assure you, if they discover that they can't get the things they want through the filibuster, they're going to note that the filibuster's not in the Constitution, and I don't think it's going to last very long. Liberals just laid down their arms, as far as I could tell, for 2 years on this.
You've got to say something about
I saw that guy recently.
He wants me to say something about progressive populists. And one thing that was very interesting about the populists is they did feel that the Constitution had outgrown its time. And they had a lot of play with what would be a more democratic, responsive Constitution in the conditions of modern capitalism. And one of their suggestions was the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. That's where we get the 17th Amendment, because they felt that the corruption of the state legislatures was so deep that the way to handle this was to have people elect direct elections. They had their problems with representative democracy. They felt that representative democracy was too easily corrupted. And so they had another experiment, the proposition and the initiative. And that's where we get Prop 13. These poor populists are rolling in their graves. Everything they're proposing is turning into the opposite. But the significant thing is they had a very creative attitude towards the Constitution as something that should reflect the needs of society at a given moment. And one of the proposals was the abolition of the Senate, which they considered particularly obnoxious. And they did talk about that. And this type of creative politics, which was real in the late 19th and early 20th century, is now dead. We no longer have creativity of this type. And I should point out that there's a reason why Glenn Beck, every night on television, is talking about this epic as the nightmare of America. This was when all the bad seed was planted. So it's something to think about. Right.
I'm very grateful to the panel and to everything that's occurred today. It's just been a marvelous conference, and I've learned a lot. I have one question to pose to the panel. We've talked a great deal. I think we spent the entire day on domestic politics and domestic life. My question has to do with foreign politics and what we're doing abroad at this time. And I'm very curious to know your point of view with regard to the Tea Party movement and such questions as the the giant military budget of this country, for example, the wars we're pursuing in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and beyond. Does the Tea Party say anything about these matters? And what is the relationship of the Tea Party to the question of taxation, the question of expenditures of budgets in relationship to a country which has devoted itself over the last, well, for a very long time, to support for the military and its budgets?
It's a very important question. While it is not universal, there is one thing that distinguishes the current Tea Party movement from, say, the America First isolationism of previous eras is that the support for military intervention is far higher among Tea Partiers than it is amongst non-Tea Partiers. So, for instance, if you take a look at the firm behind the Tea Party Express, an organization calling itself the Our Country Deserves America PAC, the principles behind that, for instance, also worked with an organization prior called Move America Forward, the pro-war organization that was created to harass anti-war demonstrators, and among other things is infamous for creating the I Love Gitmo bumper stickers. Right. So I mean, so at least segments of the Tea Party have not adopted the kind of pullback isolationist foreign policy that Ron Paul and the Campaign for Liberty acolytes have, but a number of them, have. So there's a split there. It's not 100%, but overall there's a deafening silence amongst them in terms of what the heck to do with the situations that have been created under conservative rule. But there is a general high level of support for a high military budget for continuing to do that, and virtually no discussion of how the heck to pay for it.
Hello. This is a question for the whole panel, but based upon what Professor Disch has laid out. I want to point out that whiteness as property does go back to the beginning, and that liberalism as individualism was developed in the 19th century, and that nationalism actually goes back to the independence movement. But there's one structure that's left out of that list, and that's the slave patrols. The slave patrols were founded at the beginning of the 18th century and lasted all the way up through to the end of the Civil War as an intermediary control stratum, which, as Ted Allen has theorized, was necessary for the stability of colonialism, slavery, and then Jim Crow. Now, it is often said that the slave patrols were the mother of the modern police department. And what we have today is a prison industry and a very, very strong urban police rule that functions as a control stratum in the United States today. Now, my question then is, for anybody, what is the relationship between the Tea Party and the prison industry and the way in which the police function with respect to it, which have made it the largest prison industry in the world, 75% of the inmates being of color?
Given the racialized nature of the prison population, there has been considerable speculation that there is a relationship between the number of people of color who have been disenfranchised and a different outcome in elections. So I think there is a very interesting set of dynamics that are under theorized. But yeah, I think things can sometimes be much more complicated than we know, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer other than to say that I think one of the points of most of us on this panel is that race is central to this, as is gender, as is the understanding that if things get out of control by the other, whoever the other is defined as, then a strong central government with the ability to arrest people is a good thing. And as a civil libertarian, I don't think it is a good thing. But I think that a lot of folks in this room are really worried about where the Tea Party is going. And I want to say stop whining and get organizing, because if you're being out-organized in a democracy and all you're doing is whining, then you have no one to blame but myself, and I'm part of this. We as people who are concerned about this, if you're concerned about this, have to understand that democracy is not a spectator sport. And if they are out organizing us, shame on us. And if we're mad at Obama for not doing what we want him, we got to have his back against racist and other attacks by the right, but we got to be close enough then to kick his butt to do what he promised us.
Persons on this panel. We actually don't have time, so thank you. But I'd like to thank everyone. If we could just have a round of applause for the panel.
I'm going to ask the panel to stay here because we're short on time, and I want to offer just some brief closing remarks and thank yous. Again, my name is Christine Trost, and I'm the program director for the Center for the Comparative Study of Right-Wing Movements here at Berkeley, and I'm also assistant director for the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, where the center is housed, and I'm also one of the conference organizers. When we began to plan this conference last February, the Tea Party was receiving a lot of media attention, and there was a great deal of speculation about the impact that the movement and Tea Party candidates would have on American politics. But there was very little scholarship on it. Indeed, at the time, some commentators were dismissing the Tea Party as an elite-driven media construction that would fade away as swiftly as it appeared. And to be honest, and Larry, I think will agree with me, we were a little nervous about planning a conference for the fall. We weren't absolutely certain that the Tea Party would still be active by the time the fall election came around. And we certainly didn't predict that there would be hundreds of Tea Party candidates running for House and Senate seats in the general election, with many of them on the Republican ticket. We did sense, however, that the mobilizations that were happening around the country, which involved significant numbers of people who identified with the Tea Party, marked an important moment in American politics and a new development in politics on the right in this country, and thus was worthy of study. The subtitle of this conference, which I want to remind everybody about, is Emerging Analyses of the Tea Party Movement. And that's important to remember. I want to thank our scholars in particular for taking the leap of faith here and going out on a limb and presenting their scholarship before all of the analysis and data is in. Indeed, it's still very early. The November election is still around the corner. But I do think we have established today that those who make up the Tea Party are not to be dismissed. I think this conference has also succeeded in shedding new light on the Tea Party, its origins, constituencies, and likely impacts on American politics, both now and in the future. And in this way, the conference and the scholarship presented today have begun to fill an important gap. Additionally, I hope that this conference has demonstrated the importance of approaching scholarship on the right, indeed any scholarship, I would argue, in an interdisciplinary way, which is a key goal of our center. That is to understand new ruptures and new movements in American politics and society. We require not only expertise of political scientists and experts on political parties and elections and public opinion, but we also require the historical contextualizations and the theoretical and substantive insights of political theorists, of sociologists, of historians, of race and gender scholars, and also of journalists. So hopefully by initiating this interdisciplinary dialogue and by including your questions and insights in the conversation, our understanding of the political phenomenon known as the Tea Party has been deepened, enriched, and we have moved the conversation forward in some way today. In addition to pointing to new areas of research and new questions to work on in the coming months and perhaps years. In addition to scholarly lessons, I think the speakers at this conference, especially the ones on this panel, have pointed to some interesting political lessons, both for those on the right and on the left. The research presented today suggests that the Tea Party supporters are part of a very active, very conservative wing of the Republican Party. And to the extent that Tea Party candidates and activists are able to frame their message and their issues in ways that appeal to a larger and more moderate segment of the American public, they are likely to wield significant influence at the polls and within the Republican Party, and perhaps move it further to the right. But there also seems to be a lesson here for the left. To the extent that Tea Party activists and candidates succeed in mobilizing a significant segment of the American public and start winning elections, those on the left will need to take seriously the challenge that they pose to progressive politics and figure out how best to respond. So perhaps the Tea Party will not only mobilize the right in this country, but also the left. After this November election, the scholars who presented their research today have agreed to revise their papers in light of new data that's gathered, and we plan to edit and publish these papers in the form of an edited volume. So if you registered for this conference today and you gave us your email address, we will be emailing you when this publication is finished, announcing it and hoping that you'll be interested in reading about it. Also, in 1 week, we're going to post a link on the center's website to a video file of this conference, which we encourage you to share with anyone who may have wanted to come but wasn't able to come today. This conference is the product of a collaboration, and there are many people that Larry and I would like to thank. First, we'd like to thank our co-sponsors who provided financial support and helped us get the word out about this conference. These include the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, the Institute of Governmental Studies, the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the Haas Diversity Research Center, the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities, the Center for Race and Gender, the Center for the Study of Social Change, the American Culture Center, and the Berkeley Undergraduate Political Science Association. So I want to thank those co-sponsors. Kathleen McClay from Media Relations was also instrumental in helping us to get the word out about the conference and reach members of the press who will hopefully write about this so that millions of people will have access to the insights that were shared today. She also worked tirelessly to try to get C-SPAN to cover this conference, but unfortunately they declined. But anyway, we thank Kathleen for her help with this conference. We'd also like to thank members of our planning committee, our conference planning committee, Professors Paola Bacchetta, Carol Jaffe, Russ Ellis, and Michael Omi. And our wonderful graduate student researcher, Rebecca Alexander. Becky, please stand. So in addition to helping conceptualize the conference today, Becky worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that it ran smoothly today, and I'm really grateful for your help. We'd also like to thank the staff at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, where our center is housed, for their assistance with the many logistics and details required to pull off this event, including Elizabeth Carlin. Elizabeth, are you there? Okay, yay! She's been at the registration desk all day, and also Eva Cito, so thank you. And also our volunteers, Samantha Fitzgerald, Cecilia Lucas, and Caleb Westberg, who showed up early this morning and helped us prepare for the day, so thank you. I especially want to thank our speakers and our panel chairs who shared with us their outstanding scholarship and insights and gave us much food for thought today. I also want to thank them for sticking with my stringent time rules. It's not easy to condense a 40-page paper into a 12-minute presentation, and I appreciate the fact that everybody stuck to their time limit. Lastly, we'd like to thank you, our audience, for your interest, for your many thoughtful questions throughout the day. I'd like to also make a plug for our center and finish on this. We are dedicated to nurturing new scholarship, on the right in the US, as well as in other parts of the world. So in addition to planning conferences and colloquia like today that feature an interdisciplinary mix of scholars who study right-wing ideology, politics, and organizational forms and their likely direction in the 21st century, the center promotes research, offers mini-grants, fellowships, and training opportunities to UC Berkeley graduate students and undergraduates, and publishes findings. We hope that all of you will continue to follow the work of our center, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much.